Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from the Center for Israel Education here in Atlanta. I'm Ken Stein, the president of the Center for Israel Education and an Emory University professor emeritus of contemporary Middle Eastern history, political science, and Israel studies. I'm pleased today to have Haviv Rettig Gur and Einat Wilf with us for our 12th webinar in this series, Israel's 9/11 Hamas-Israel War. As we enter 2024 and 3 months of fighting between Israel and Hamas, we want to take a step back in our series and have a good look at this perspective and see where it's going. On that Sabbath morning of October 7th, several thousand Hamas terrorists poured across Israel's border, and before the day of carnage was over, Hamas terrorists had raped, beheaded, burned, and murdered and took hostages. As time passes, the brutality of October 7th reaches into Israel's response, but it also recedes into people understanding what did happen. For those of you who followed our work over the last 7 years, thank you for being among the many who have visited our website, israeled.org. Join others and learn what you can about perspective and context. I would venture a guess that our organization stands alone for its continued production and promotion of Israel learning. So let's get into some questions. Would you comment, please, on the status of Israel's external security today? What has Israel learned in these 3 months? What has it accomplished? And where might it be going vis-a-vis the war against Hamas and on the other regional fronts?
The short answer is the security situation of Israel, the regional strategic situation, however you want to frame it, is much, much, much better than it was 3 months ago. It doesn't feel that it's much, much, much better than it was 3 months ago, because 3 months ago we were asleep and we were not watching carefully. We were watching, we were noting, we were following, we were tracking. We at my newspaper were writing constantly about the growth of Iranian proxies and this noose that was slowly developing around us, driven by Iran. Hamas is not Iranian, Hamas is not Shiite, but this version of Hamas, the Nukhba force and what it was capable of, and the planning and the care and the precision and the compartmentalization that allowed it to evade Israeli intelligence, in as much as it did, without taking away from the failure of Israeli intelligence, Hamas did do something very successful and astonishing that we have never seen those capabilities before. And a lot of that is Iranian training and Iranian funding and Iranian planning. Almost exactly what Hamas did on October 7 is something that Hezbollah has been planning for a long, long time. And Israel, that thought Hamas was deterred, also thought Hezbollah was deterred up in the north. Israel woke up on October 7th to the realization that just as it had not understood Hamas, it had not understood the psychology of Hamas, so too it probably doesn't understand the psychology of Hezbollah, of the militias in Syria, in Iraq, of the Houthis, of Iran. And so the Israel that woke up on October 7 woke up to the immediacy, the urgency, the vast danger of the threat. It's an Israel with vast capabilities. It's an Israel whose capabilities we're only starting to see. Gaza is the beginning of a very long war. If Israel had waited 10 more years, that war would have been more fraught, more dangerous. Israel would have started from a much worse situation, and its enemies would have been much, much stronger. So it was a wake-up call we needed, and that wake-up call means that our objective security situation is now better than what it was.
Waking up is one thing. One thing we've learned, and that's a lesson we seem to constantly need to get again and again, is not to underestimate our enemies. I agree with Haviv. On October 7th, what we've seen is a very capable Palestinian operation. And I think this at least should give us a basis to finally dispose with any notion of the poor Palestinians as some kind of charity basket case that is constantly in need of help and assistance. What we've seen is a highly capable people who have decided to devote their capacities, their thinking, their strategy, not to build something for themselves, for their prosperity, but in order to destroy what Israel has built. And in that sense, we've seen that Hamas did probably the most successful effort on behalf of the century-long Palestinian ethos of no Jewish state. Personally, I don't think we've woken up enough. Maybe we've woken up militarily. Maybe we begin to understand what Hamas built in Gaza, the scope of the tunnel system, the investment in the infrastructure. But I think there's still a tendency to underestimate their ambition. Palestinians have always told us that as far as they're concerned, the Jewish state is not legitimate in any borders, in any way, shape, or form. And we constantly think that this is a fantastic goal. They can't seriously be committed to this goal. And I think what we've seen is that they're very serious about this goal. They're strategic about achieving it. And we need to consider that this is what they're trying to get, and that they at least have a serious plan for getting it. So many people say, oh, what were they thinking? Didn't they realize that Israel would retaliate? And for many years in talks about Zionism, I said that the anti-Zionists understand Israel better than anyone, because they understand that the source of Israel's strength is not its airplanes, nor its tanks, nor even the people who serve in its military, but the idea that mobilizes and inspires and motivates those people, the idea of Jewish self-determination. And what this act was very carefully designed to do is to essentially cut at the heart of Zionism and to say, we will massacre you, brutalize you in your homes. You will be back in the shtetl. It will be a pogrom. You will be defenseless. And a century of Zionism will be erased because you will feel no different than your grandparents and great-grandparents in Iraq and in Poland. And we've run into the battle, but it is a question that is hanging over Israel. Have we done our job? What does it mean if we didn't do our job? And the fact that Jews are endangered around the world, and it is claimed that it's because of the existence of Israel, because of Zionism, that is part of the global message that says you tried to achieve dignity, you tried to achieve equality, but we are only ever going to accept you in your proper place, which is stateless, powerless, defenseless, and at the mercy of those who decide which role you're going to have.
You said, I don't think we've woken up enough. What would you like Israel or world Jewry to learn from this event if we haven't woken up enough? If the reality of October 7th is that we're not paying attention to what others are saying and doing to Jews and to Israelis, what is the antidote, or is there an antidote to cure an attitude held by others about us?
The historian Paul Johnson, when he wrote about the Holocaust, said that not a lot of people talk about the fact that the Nazis engaged in a massive campaign so that the Jews would not be aware of what is being done to them. But he said that one of the reasons that the campaign was so successful is that Jews could not believe that this time it would not stop at confiscating their property or killing a few of them, that they could not believe that the goal was so total, that it was everything, that it was all. I think we need to understand that we are surrounded by people who want all. I think we are not paying enough attention to that one placard that says, keep the world clean. We've seen it in a few demonstrations. You see the Star of David in a trash bin with the heading, keep the world clean. The idea that the collective Jew is what stands between this world and utopia is a very ancient idea with deadly consequences. And we need to understand that all of this fits together. As far as Hamas is concerned, as far as Hezbollah and Iran are concerned, Israel can be undone. We tend to scoff at their speeches. This is spider webs, the clock is ticking. But we need to understand that they are operating on this assumption. Those are not just speeches. Their assumption is that Israel can be undone. They feel that they have global support from what I call the Western communists. They encircle us right now with the whole notion of genocide. For 20 years, it was apartheid. Before that, it was racism, but it's the same playbook. Encircle Israel with a global mindset that says that Israel is evil. And therefore, when Israelis will be massacred, the global response will be mute, or even they deserve it. The countries that want to support Israel will find themselves limited politically in their ability to do so. And from the Iranian perspective, if they can bring down Israel, it's also a great way to bring down America, or at least to show that it's a paper tiger. That's what I think is going on, and I think we need to take them very seriously.
We need to add one more layer to what Einat is saying, because what Einat is saying isn't just true, it's the only thing they say, it's the only thing they say to themselves, it's the only thing they say to us, and it comes from a deep and authentic and real and important place that we can empathize with. We probably won't sympathize with it. We probably won't agree with them we should disappear from this earth. But if we don't understand why it makes sense to them, we won't believe that it makes sense to them. And so I just want to add to that one little piece to the puzzle, which is that for the last century and a half even, the great minds of Islam, some of the most important great minds of Islam, have been asking this one vast question. What happened to Islam? Why are we weak? Why is the West powerful? Why is science moved westward? Why can we not produce the empires that the West could produce in the 20th century? What happened to us? And the answers to that vast question, and it is a question asked from Morocco to Malaysia, the answers to that question built so much of the Arab Muslim world, certainly, but also of the rest of the Muslim world that we see today. The Iranian regime is one of the answers to that question. So is the Muslim Brotherhood that produced Hamas and the regimes today of Qatar and Erdogan and Al-Qaeda, by the way, and produced pacifist movements in the Muslim world. You don't hear about them because they're pacifist, but they exist. And essentially, the answer that Iran draws from this ideology of Islamic renewal, that it actually, don't say this out loud because they'll be insulted, but they borrowed it from the Sunnis. But the answer that the Shia regime in Iran actually gives to the question, what happened to Islam, is that we modernized. Modernizing is not the source of Western power. It is the Western tool for dividing us into modern nation states. The British invented Iraq, the French invented Lebanon. By subdividing us in that way, they keep us down. It really is important to remember that Islam's founding experience is one of vast, astonishing conquest. Muhammad, the Prophet himself, is a conquering emperor in his lifetime. And one of the arguments Islam has made since its birth, public, open, constant, is that because Muslims were astonished at their own success, is that is one of the proofs of the divinity of Islam and of divine grace over this new religion. There are many other proofs. One is the poetic power of the Quran. And there are all these proofs. And if anyone ever delved a little bit into medieval sort of debates between Christians and Jews and Muslims, all the religions say these things about them. But the point is that is one of the great proofs. And so if you are a believer, if you are someone like Rashid Rida in Cairo 100 years ago, who is the teacher of the Grand Mufti of the Palestinians in the 1930s and 40s, who set the Palestinian national movement on this path, and who was read also by the people who would create the present-day Iranian regime ideology. If you are one of those people, then the weakness of Islam isn't a geopolitical problem. The weakness of Islam is a theological problem. It is evidence of a distancing of Islam from divine grace. It is evidence that Islam is wrong and is going away from the divine plan for history, from the God to which Islam is supposed to be a servant of and pay fealty to. So for the Iranian regime, and again, they say this so often, literally daily, in every point, and Khamenei says this himself, For the Iranian regime, the problem of Israel isn't some simple problem that we're not Muslim. The problem with Israel is that we are the weakest, the most pathetic. One of the things Rashid Rida wrote in Al-Manar in 1898, in his journal he had in Cairo in 1898, and he wrote it after following the minutes of the first Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897. The following year he writes, "Wake up, you complacent non-entities." That's a quote, an op-ed he writes in his journal in Cairo to Arabs in Palestine. And he says, you won't just be conquered. He himself is conquered by the British. That doesn't bother him to be living in Egypt in 1898 under the thumb of the British. The British are a vast empire. That's okay. You're going to be conquered by the most pathetic peoples of the world, and they are the peoples who are being thrown out of every country, and those countries will say, these dregs of humanity have conquered you. The problem with the Jews and Zionism is that the weakest of the weak, the most pathetic of pathetic, have pushed back Islam. It's why in the Muslim world, there are no marches against Assad. There are no marches for the 250,000 dead of Yemen or the mass starvation or the 1.5 million displaced in Sudan. Israel matters. And it has nothing to do with the death toll. It has to do with what Israel says about whether Islam really is Islam anymore. For Islam, the problem with Israel isn't that Israel exists or pushed back Islam. The problem with Israel is that Islam has been unable to destroy it. If it could destroy Israel, if Iran knew it could destroy Israel, it wouldn't have to. But because it can't, it has to, because that's the beginning of the return of Islam as an agent in history. And so what Einat is saying is the biggest story of the Muslim world that we have to contend with, and it's not going anywhere the day after the Gaza war.
I hate to use the phrase that was coined back in the 1980s and early 90s. It's a battle that might be called a battle between concepts or civilization. It may be a battle where Israel is seen as the hallmark or the bulwark of liberty, freedom, democracy, individual freedoms, not relying upon community or necessarily the philosophy that might come from divine scripture, but the individual right to make decisions by themselves when they want to. And Israel has proved to be successful in promoting that in a territory. The question is it really a defense of the Palestinians, or is it a defense of a concept? My sense is Western liberal democracies support Israel in part because of this attack on Israel, because they see it as an attack on the stability and the regional integrity that could disrupt the international community quite considerably by controlling this major source of oil. If the oil didn't exist, I doubt the United States and the West would care about the Middle East. It basically goes back to what's beneath the sands of the Arabian Peninsula and what is the geography. But we need to know better what the motivation is of those who want to see the state of Israel disappear. Keeping that in mind and in line, how can there be better reporting about what this encounter is about between Hamas and Israel? What would you like to see more people write about in the major outlets that go outside the state of Israel?
Generally, journalism deals with what's happening right now. Ideally, I would appreciate it if more journalists were aware of what they are channeling, in the sense that they need to understand that they are operating in a certain market. My colleague Shani Moore said that the problem has never been the supply, it's always been the demand. So when people say why Israel doesn't do better work in PR or more stories of this kind, or we should tell these stories and this stories, the issue is much less about what Israel supplies. Sure, we could always do better. The bigger story is the demand, is the market. And the market in the West continues to be a market for the story of evil Israel. That is generally where the market is. And not that it's likely, but it would be nice if journalists actually understood why certain stories succeed more, why they are encouraged to write certain stories and not others, to be aware of the language that is being used. Why are words like apartheid, genocide, occupation, why have these words been twisted out of their original meaning to pertain to Israel? What is the bigger story here? And of course, what we're not seeing enough, and what journalists and opinion writers should be doing, is connect the dots to see the bigger story at play. And that's what's not being reported enough. And of course, what's not being reported enough is to take Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, Iranians at their word. Generally, there's too much going on in journalism of a phenomena that I called West-plaining, which is when Western diplomats and journalists explain away what Palestinians just say. So Palestinians will say, we'll do October 7th again and again and again. They support Hamas. They're thrilled and exhilarated by October 7th. They celebrate it. And journalists will still in the West plain it away as a poor people just fighting for freedom and against injustice and against occupation, not giving Palestinians the respect of actually taking them at their word.
Let me defend journalism by arguing that journalism must fail, cannot do anything but fail. Journalism is inherently an impossible task. Journalists are the people in the room who understand the least about what's happening in that room. Everyone else in that room is there to do something, and the journalist is there to try and tell the story, but usually has never done the thing itself, and usually turns to everyone else in the room as experts. Why are they experts? Because the journalist has no idea what's going on. One of my first stories ever as a journalist, 17, 16 years ago, I was in the room sitting next to the education minister in the education committee of the Knesset, a professor of philosophy who was arguing that the Israeli education budget has to be normalized by purchasing power parity, and the Harvard PhD economist from the finance ministry arguing it has to be normalized by GDP per capita, and if one is correct, we're overspending by billions in our education system, and if the other is correct, we're underspending by billions in the education system. And I was a medieval philosophy major at Hebrew University trying to tell Israelis whether or not they are overspending or underspending on their education system by billions. And that experience was a wonderful first experience in journalism. Journalists don't know the story. So that's point A, and it's driven a lot by social media, but also it's part of many journalistic cultures. Israel, for example, is a journalistic culture of complete and total partisanship on purpose. Our newspaper industry was founded by political parties as political party pamphleteering. The Davar newspaper, the most important newspaper of 60 years ago, was a Mapai Party pamphlet. And so we don't have, for example, the American private journalism. In America, journalism is polarized, but there's an ethos that maybe it shouldn't be, or it shouldn't look like it too much, or it's failing somehow. That ethos doesn't exist in Israel. The journalists in Israel believe their social function to be serving the camp, serving the tribe, serving the party. And that's also the same in Britain and elsewhere. And so you have all of these problems all intersecting. We have found at the Times of Israel, frankly, that you're never going to be objective. You're never really going to know the full story. You're writing a very first draft of history. And nevertheless, a journalist that has the humility to understand that and that tries to be objective and fails, because you're going to fail, journalists are bound to fail, is a much better journalist than the one who doesn't try and isn't aware of those things. Journalism is trying to do a thing you cannot possibly do. That's A. To B, I disagree on one point with Einat, and I agreed on everything else she said. I disagree with Shani, excuse me. Israel's really bad at Hasbara, which just means explaining. And I don't mean it's bad in the sense that it doesn't do marketing well. When an Israeli company needs to sell a can of soda, it's amazing at marketing. It can hack the human brainstem like nobody's business. And when Israeli political campaigns need to sell messages, they are amazing at hacking that human brainstem. And then when the Israelis get up on television on CNN to defend the country, they collapse, they implode, they can't do it. We had a war begin on October 7th. And I think it was 1 week after the war when Galit resigned. Galit Distal Etzbarian is the Minister of Public Diplomacy. Now, that was a fake ministry created as a part of Netanyahu's coalition problems to give as many people jobs as possible in the cabinet. And she's also a patriot and a lover of her country. And so as soon as the war began, she got up on national television and she said, my fellow Israelis, this fake ministry is legitimate politicking in peacetime. But I'm not going to waste public money in a war because I'm a proud Israeli. And she resigned and she shut down her ministry. The dumbest thing she ever did in public service was the most patriotic thing she ever did in public service. This is a person who concluded that because a war just started, the public diplomacy ministry should shut down. This ministry was founded and shut down about 5 times. Israelis found it because they hear something about how they're going to have to explain themselves to the world at some point, and then close it when they can't figure out what it's supposed to do. And I would just want to say one point about that. There's a reason. We're not stupid. At the heart and soul and core of Zionism, not Zionism, the ideological movement, but maybe we'll call it Zionism, the emotional state, as Derek Penzlar calls it, is the impulse not to justify ourselves. When an Israeli is told, explain yourself, the Israeli's first reaction is to recoil. Absolutely not. I am the Jew who no longer asks for permission. I am the Jew who does not explain himself. Read Auto-Emancipation by Leo Pinsker in 1881. This goes beyond Herzl and before Herzl. I am the Jew who no longer lives at the pleasure of the world. And so to justify ourselves is something painful, and that runs deep in our ethos. And so Israelis go on television in the world and people say to them, tell me about the dead children in Gaza. And you had people like Naftali Bennett say, how dare you ask me about dead children in Gaza? Do you know what they did to us on October 7? And the poor CNN anchor said, we just talked 5 minutes about October 7. We do know, but tell me about the dead children in Gaza. And Naftali Bennett says, how dare you? And then Naftali Bennett thinks he's done such a good job that he posts on Twitter that clip, proudly showing how he did not justify ourselves to the world. Well, then why'd you go on CNN? The point is that Israel is deeply, culturally, profoundly, as part of the core of our culture, we have a problem telling the world our story. And journalists who are already gonna fail automatically because that's what journalism is, then have to get out of us our story. It's awfully hard to get our story out of us. Also, a bunch of journalists are bigots. So all of those layers all together is Israel's problem in the international press.
When I teach it, I say Jews have every right to self-determination like every other people. And that's why Zionism exists. Shlomo Avineri just passed away. One of his great articles he ever wrote was Zionism was a Jewish liberation movement. Phenomenal article, which he wrote back in 79. There's something called the Jerusalem Quarterly. Why can't an Israeli prime minister, or why can't an Israeli journalist, or why can't someone who's speaking about Zionism just simply say, Jews have the right to self-determination. That is our reason for having a state. And just don't deny it. Don't say, don't tell me I need to justify myself, but actually make a statement that says Jews have the right to a place of their own. They've always had a right to a place of their own. They have a historical connection to that place. That's why we're there. Can we move on to the next question, please? But we don't do that. We want to engage someone in telling them why they're wrong in the question that they asked. We don't play offense. We want to play defense because we think it's better to debate it like, what's the Parshat HaShavua? Don't debate the meaning of the Parsha. We know it's every week the same Parsha. And I just don't understand, why is it so difficult just to make a statement and take it directly out of your national anthem, Lihiyot Am Chofshi B'Artzenu, and move on? I think it's an unwillingness to either state it, or it's an inability of either Jewish kids in America or Jewish adults in America, or maybe Israeli kids and maybe Israeli adults, just to use the one sentence. You don't have to make it complex.
Or Ken, let me suggest that Israelis are profoundly provincial, unaware. No, truly, they speak Hebrew, right? They don't actually speak English. One of my favorite facts about Israelis is that the day Obama was sworn in, he had 70% favorability in Israel, much higher than in America. And the day Trump was sworn in, he had 70% favorability in Israel, much better than in America. Israelis are not living the American culture war. No matter how bad it gets, they're only dimly aware of it from the news because they've heard about it. They're far away, they're parochial, they think about themselves, they speak a foreign language, right? American Jews sometimes need to be reminded of that. But the people who are desperate for Israel to be justified are American Jews. And so for American Jews, Israel's failure to tell its story is a catastrophe because American Jews live among everyone else. And America's liberalism, America's morality saved American Jews from the 20th century. And so that moral discourse is a homeland for American Jews in a way that the land is a homeland for Israeli Jews. That land saved them from, didn't save them from the 20th century, but at least rescued them from the second half. American Jews is half the Jews of the world. When American Jews need something, that's not a small thing. That is a big deal. But Israelis are congenitally, profoundly, who they are is the Jew who can't justify themselves, who recoils from justifying themselves, and who American Jews are the Jews who need to turn the Jewish story into this big moral victory over history. The question is, who's doing the talking? I teach my kids at Tikva. I tell them they have a homeland and they need to, but I'm not going to tell that to the world. If someone says to me, you don't have that homeland, that's not yours, go away, I'm going to say to them, okay, I hope that makes you happy. Enjoy it. I'm still going to live and breathe. So get back to me when you want to have another conversation. I truly don't care. But for American Jews, that is something that needs to be said publicly.
I'm not asking Israelis to be American Jews, and I'm not asking them to understand who we are. I'm just asking them to say, I fight in the Israel Defense Forces because I believe I have the right to self-determination. That's all. Every Israeli can say that out loud. They don't need me. And that has nothing to do with satisfying what my ears need. I know American Jews don't know Israel's story. I've been at it for 44 years. Yesterday in Lebanon, a high-ranking Hamas official was killed. Israel is trying to deter others, I think, from doing what happened on October 7th. And they're also wanting to punish those who were engaged in it, whether at that particular act or previous acts. How long will it take for Israel to reestablish two kinds of deterrence? It's military intelligence deterrence and the deterrence that says it's willing to take a risk to try and find some sort of accommodation between it and its next door neighbors. In other words, isn't there a psychological deterrence that has been eroded as a result of October 7th?
The idea that we need to restore deterrence, we now know that there wasn't. We told ourselves a story that they were deterred, whereas they were quietly, effectively planning the attack. If anything, I would hope that our intelligence agencies would now do two things. First, listen when it's quiet. I have a friend who's socially very aware. When someone kind of drops off the map, she's like, haven't heard from that person, something's happening. So she's a person who's very good at actually realizing when to be suspicious when things are quiet. So we need to realize that quiet doesn't mean deterred. So for example, now with Hezbollah, when we see Hezbollah is not operating, there are still military people, military personnel, or commentators on TV that say Hezbollah is deterred. And I think most Israelis hear that and they're going nuts because they're saying, have we not learned anything? The fact that Hezbollah is not acting now is not a sign of deterrence, just as the fact that Hamas did not act in the last 2 years was not a sign of deterrence. It was a sign of patience and careful planning of a horrific attack. Mm-hmm. So there's no deterrence to actually restore. We need to rethink our entire strategy. We had some strategy which we call deterrence, but we know it wasn't. So we need to rethink our strategy completely, which is how we protect our borders. To what extent do we engage in acts that are self-generated? Do we go back to being a military that takes the initiative that was characteristic more of the 50s and 60s? We clearly became much more a military that hunkers down. Do we need to change our whole thinking about how we operate? Israel historically has this vision. Because we're small, we rely on intelligence and the Air Force. Is it something that we can afford to do? Should we do regular wars, regular invasions to ensure that there's no buildup on the other side? So I think the whole concept of going back to deterrence has to go away.
Yeah, I think that's right. Democracies are always surprised by war. They're always startled that the other side is willing to suffer terrible things and inflict terrible things because we all just want to buy and sell and get on with our lives. But the other side is not deterred and is not deterred by the amount of pain we can inflict on them. We thought they were deterred by us because look at our firepower. But in fact, they had built Gaza for 17 years to force us to, the only way we could ever actually fight Hamas in Gaza in a way that would destroy Hamas in Gaza, to cut through the civilian population. And Hamas built Gaza for 17 years for that purpose. And that deterred us. We were not willing to pay that price of Palestinian civilian deaths. I happen to believe it's because we can't massacre tremendous numbers of civilians. You don't have to believe good things about us to understand that it's a massive cost for us on the international stage to have to get Hamas out of Gaza right now, and we're paying it, and we're going to pay it. But we're only willing to pay it because of October 7th. Until October 7th, we were deterred by our own firepower. Edward Luttwak talks about weapons that are too powerful to be used. The nuclear weapon is so powerful, it's useless because nobody can use it, and therefore it's a useless thing. And so our immense firepower, Hamas made useless by forcing us to cut through civilian populations, and then on October 7 left us no choice. So the whole question of deterrence is this incredibly complicated thing that cuts in many different directions. One of the interesting points for me of deterrence is the Saudi position right now. The Saudis are extremely pleased that October 7th happened. I don't think they're pleased that lots of people were massacred on October 7th, or they're pleased with what's happening to Gaza. But what they're very pleased at is that Israel's being tested, because they were about to put a lot of eggs in this basket. They were about to pay some significant political cost in the region for allying with Israel against Iran. And now Hamas, an Iranian proxy, functionally, certainly what we saw on October 7 was the Iranian proxy side of Hamas, is forcing Israel to show whether or not it can seriously contend with these new strategies that the proxies are deploying. If we can, Saudi Arabia wants to triple down on us because we're exactly the ally they need. And if we can't, they dodge that bullet of allying with an ally that's not going to deliver when the chips are down. And so the Saudis are extremely happy this happened the day before the agreement. That is all this big rubric of deterrence. Deterrence is the enemy understands that we can win, not that we can hurt them, because they're immune to a lot of kinds of pain that we would consider serious pain. For example, their civilian deaths, but we can actually destroy them. And so we now have to prove that we can actually slice off those Iranian proxies. Hezbollah's entire reason for existing is to be a deterrence to us, to force us to face a massive cost to the Iran-Israel confrontation. We'll have that northern front, we'll have that 150,000 rockets, we'll suffer. Well, then when we enter that war with Iran, that long war, we need to start cutting out those proxies that are deterring us. And so there is a war coming with Lebanon. There has to be, there's no choice. There is a war that will neutralize in some significant or effective way the other proxies that Iran has around us. That's all after Hamas. And then there's the Iran engagement. And by then the Saudis are on board, of course, I think. And so, yeah, deterrence, we did not deter them at all. We fundamentally misunderstood how deterrence works. And not even in the psychology of our enemies, just generally. It's a complicated thing. It's not a simple thing. I think we understand it now. And I think that now we are going to achieve a kind of deterrence that is, we know how to destroy you. That is the deterrence we need, and nothing less. And Einat disagrees with me.
Oh no, I'm
Go ahead.
skeptical.
I'm sorry. Go ahead,
that
Einat, please.
leaders really understand what you're saying. That's all I'm saying.
What does the political landscape look like when this battle is over? And I know we can't actually even define what over is, let alone when. What's realistic about what Gaza's relationship is to the Palestinians on the West Bank or to the Palestinian Arab National Movement when this ceases or ends?
I have a hope. It sounds very optimistic, and so it's probably going to be dashed very, very quickly. But my hope is that Hamas is basically the last game in town. Palestinians have an elite that has been selling them for about 130 years on all these different versions of the same story about us. That we are something artificial, we are a Western construct, we are imperialism, we're colonialism, we always have the backing of some empire or another. When Russian-speaking Jews fleeing pogroms land in Jaffa port in the 1890s, The Arab elites talk about them as Tsarist agents because they're Russian speakers, and the Tsar is the great enemy of the Ottoman Empire, and they think of themselves as Ottoman elites. And then when it becomes a British-held territory, Britain actually supports Zionism really tremendously for some years, and then flips on Zionism just in time for the Holocaust, leaving the Jews nowhere to flee Europe. And to the Palestinians, that support means we're actually a branch of British imperialism. And then in 48, we're under an American arms embargo. And so our main supplier of weapons is Stalin through the Czechs. And so when the Egyptian parliament declares war on us, the prime minister of Egypt, in asking for that declaration of war in parliament, says that they are communists. And he cites the kibbutz movement, and he cites the weapon shipments. The actual declaration of war to save Palestine from the Jews is a war, officially, technically, I'm quoting, on atheism and nihilism. In other words, communism. And then the French support us in the 50s and 60s, and then, of course, the Americans since the 70s. And they always talk about that as we are artificial, we are weak, we are doomed to fall, exactly what Einat was saying at the very beginning. And the only reason it hasn't panned out yet is the empire that backs us, whose long arm we are. The empire keeps changing, but that doesn't change the narrative. We are a colonialist power that will be driven out by terrorism, like the French from Algeria. And if only they can disattach the empire from us, we're doomed to fail. I want them to wake up from that. I want them to wake up from that. What college kids in America think will not change my children's future. What screaming crowds in Paris think will not affect profoundly my children's future. But what Palestinians believe about us will have a profound and immediate and long-term effect on my children's future. And what I need them to know about us is that we can't leave. We have nowhere to go. Half of us would have to go back to Baghdad and Yemen. We are not going anywhere. And that changes the strategy from a strategy of anti-colonial terrorism to a strategy of, frankly, nonviolence, at which point they win. In other words, if they're nonviolent, what excuse do I have for 90% of the military regime in the West Bank? Internal Israeli discourse, I lose half of my argument. I lose 4/5 of my argument if they're actually nonviolent. And how do you wake up from the promise of full redemption through holy war? I think through catastrophic failure. I don't want that catastrophic failure. This is the only way to get Hamas out of Gaza, and Hamas set that cost, not me. But if that catastrophic failure can deliver that, that is one hell of a silver lining. And so I have this hope that this story that for 100 years has been delivered in different ways, framed in different ways to the times and to the empire and to the specific ideology, we're imperialists and then we're colonial, but it's the same story. It's the same story Rashida Tlaib delivers now in the halls of Congress of the colonialist Israel. If they can wake up from that one thing, the only thing they've ever tried, and engage us with a real theory of mind of us, we stop being this demonic construct and we become people they can actually influence and engage with, it's a different future.
I share the dream. I will say that the only reason that I actually think it matters a lot what the screaming students in Paris or America say is that fuels the Palestinian ability to keep thinking what they're thinking. If the Israeli-Palestinian conflict had ever been just that, Jews and Arabs between the river and the sea, that conflict would have been over long, long, long ago. The only reason that it continues for so long is that whenever Palestinians have faced failure, my favorite thinker on societies in crisis is René Girard. He says societies in crisis ask two questions: what to do and who to blame. Societies that ask what to do emerge from the crisis and move forward. Societies that ask who to blame wallow in the crisis and collapse onto themselves. Now, every time the Palestinians faced catastrophe, and they faced quite a few, they could have asked what to do. And they could have asked a moment that Haviv describes that says, these decades of trying to get rid of a Jewish state have been misspent, complete misuse of resources. Let's move on and let's develop a constructive idea of living next to the Jewish state rather than instead of it or on top of it. But every time they could be in a crisis where they ask that question, whatever anti-Jewish ideology of the time exists Nazism in the 30s and 40s, Pan-Arabism in the 50s, Soviet communism in the 60s and 70s, Sunni jihadism in the 90s and first 20s, Iranian Shiite jihadism now, and what I call, as I said, Western communists now. They're all rushing in to tell Palestinians, no, 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 don't change how you think. Don't ask what to do. Keep asking who to blame. And it's the Jews, and you are the pure, innocent victims of the nefarious Jews, thereby depriving the Palestinians once more of an opportunity to change. And this synthesis, this synergy between the Palestinian desire to fight the Jews and anti-Jewish ideologies that found the Palestinians as a useful service in that. And let's admit the truth, the Palestinians would have interested exactly nobody if they weren't fighting the Jews. So they always received the support of the anti-Jewish, anti-Zionist ideology of the moment. And that ideology always ensured that they continue to fuel the Palestinians fighting the Jews rather than changing course. So for that, I agree with Haviv. That's the goal. The goal is a transformation of the Palestinian ethos away from destroying the Jewish state to building something for themselves. But for them to go through that transformation, they have to be cut off from the global anti-Zionist or anti-Jewish fuel that fuels their ongoing battle.
Well, what a wonderful intellectual course we took today. I'm deeply grateful to the both of you for your incisive remarks and inspiring thoughts. I'm impressed by Haviv, who managed to weave in that there were two Israeli prime ministers without actually saying so, both Golda Meir and Menachem Begin, saying, we're not going anywhere because we have no place to go. It's a phrase that's always used by both the left and the right in the state of Israel. That would be a great response to anyone who asks why you justify yourself. All you have to say is, I got no place to go. Anyway, for the two of you, thank you so very much for your time, your wisdom.
And we're home.